Jemar, earlier today, he met with a smaller group of people, and you talked about racism being prejudice plus power. Can you lay out that concept?
Yeah, we talk a lot about race and racism, but we actually tend not to have agreed upon definitions. And so then we're talking past each other, and what do we mean? And so it's an important question because you'll often hear the concern from people about reverse racism or can't black people be racist too? And it depends on your definition of racism, right? And so one shorthand definition that I sometimes find helpful is that racism is prejudice plus power. So we tend to be familiar with the first term, prejudice, where people don't like one another because of whatever reason, your language, their country of origin, your skin color. And in that sense, anyone can be racist because in the Christian view, everyone has sin. Everybody goes against God's law somehow. And so black people can be prejudiced, white people can be prejudiced, young, old, men, women, all of that. Anyone can be prejudiced. But when we talk about the issue of race, it's not just people being prejudiced. It's not just people not liking one another. You have to have prejudice plus power, because what power does is it means you can impose your prejudices on someone else. And so you can make the laws, you can start the businesses or take them away, you can threaten and intimidate. And historically in America, we know this, right? So let's just put it out there. In terms of race, white people have had the power, and so they have been able to impose their prejudices upon various sectors of society, political, economic, and social. And so while anybody can be prejudiced, according to this definition, racism has to have that element of power as well. So I find that helpful. Another definition is that racism is a system of advantage based on race. A system of advantage. And that gets beyond this idea of interpersonal racism, which is real, it's a thing. You can not like someone personally because of who they are, where they come from, or what their color is, or what their culture is. But that's not the only kind of racism. Racism works itself out in systemic and institutional ways as well. So a system of advantage based on race says that you don't have to be personally prejudiced against anyone. All you have to do is operate within a system that gives you certain advantages and privileges because of your skin color, and then disadvantages other people because of their skin color. But it's a system. It works automatically and by itself without you ever saying, well, I don't like black people. It's not necessary in a system of advantage based on race.
Thank you.
Jemar, thank you. Thank you for that, for your talk. Really appreciate it. I've got a question, and I think a follow-up question based on your answer. You talked about at the end about looking to the margins. I'm wondering if you would mind elaborating a little bit on that, and particularly, yeah. When I think about this issue, it seems so grand and global and large. So how does looking to the margins, what does that look like, like when I leave this place?
That's good. When you're an oppressed or marginalized people group, you tend to think about and practice your faith differently. And I think that the white church has a lot to learn from the church on the margins in that regard. And so what I mean is there's a great book. I quoted Sung Chan Ra toward the end in his book, The Next Evangelicalism, but there's another book he wrote called Prophetic Lament. And in it, he makes the case that the black church in America knows how to lament, knows how to weep, because so often black people have been victimized in America because of race. At the same time, that's an element that the dominant church may be lacking in some respects, the ability to weep with those who weep, because it's been, in terms of its social context, white people have had so many advantages relative to black people, which doesn't mean life was easy or perfect, not saying that, but he goes through some of the common songs, right? You'll have Onward Christian Soldiers in one context, and then another one, you'll have Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming for to carry me home. This longing for the next world and the next life. So when I say look to the margins, look to people who have been oppressed, They've experienced injustice and been marginalized because their experience of faith is one of asking of God in the Bible, how do I endure suffering? How do I endure reproach? What does my faith look like in that context? And as the white church seeks to, if it wants to be helpful in terms of racial equality from a Christian standpoint, well, there are a lot of Christians who have understood their faith as what motivates them, what enables them to survive, persevere, and resist. And so that's what I mean by look to the margins.
That's very helpful. I don't see another questioner, so I'm gonna ask one more. So I look around this room, and I'm sure you could see it better than any of us. You look around the room, and it's a largely white audience. I teach at a university that is comprised 90+% of white upper middle class students. So we can talk till the cows come home about these ideas. We can even discuss issues, politics and other things. But this experience of being alongside people in the margins is largely removed from us. So I'm kind of wondering if you have any advice for those of us who find ourselves, perhaps because of this structural system that has perpetuated this and now placed us in a situation where we're basically around people just like us. How do we expose ourselves to the margins?
Great question. I mean, a lot of us find ourselves in racially homogenous environments, and then so what do you do with all this talk about diversity and racial equality and reconciliation? Well, one, you still teach it because you want your students or your congregation or your family or whomever to be prepared for diversity when and where it comes. So, if they're in undergrad now and in a majority white setting, they may go to the workplace or a different country or a different state or a different city where that's not always the case. So will they be prepared when that happens? The other thing to realize is diversity comes in a lot of different forms, right? Not just racial diversity, there's economic diversity, there's gender diversity, there's cultural diversity, there's linguistic diversity. And so teaching your people in whatever context they are to deal with diversity in whatever form it comes, because those principles are going to be the same, right? Equality, human dignity, all of that stuff. Lastly, though, you bring up a good point, because partly because of racism, we're isolated from one another, right? There's a long and sordid history of residential segregation, a long and sordid history of school segregation. I gave you that one example of Bob Jones University, but there are many other examples like it. And so the question arises, what are you willing to do for the sake of racial equality? Most people will not contemplate switching schools, changing neighborhoods, or doing things considered radical in order to put themselves in a more diverse environment. But if you think about the lengths to which people went to keep the races separated, will we not have to exert as much or more energy to integrate the races? And so we actually have to contemplate that which seems beyond the pale. I'm going to give up my job, or I'm going to move away from this area I've grown up in, or I'm actually going to switch schools, or I'm going to keep my kids in the public school and not the private school, or whatever. Those are the kinds of decisions, particularly on the majority, you have to contemplate. And I would argue that the historical evidence says there was a whole lot of creativity and effort made to put up divisions and barriers between the races. We need to have a whole lot of creative energy dedicated to breaking down those barriers too. I don't know who's first.
Art.
Can you hear me? Is this on?
It is. Just talk a little louder.
So could you talk a little bit about the last part? What does white supremacy look like today? And is it possible for white Christians to resist it? And if it is, then what might that look like?
Yeah. So white supremacy is a broad term in my mind, and it encompasses racism. But white supremacy speaks more broadly to the idea that our entire society has been constructed based along racial lines, which has whiteness at the center. So a very mundane example, you go to the grocery store, every other aisle is just food, but if it comes from any other place, it's called the ethnic food aisle. So what's normal is white, and everything else is other. You can think about this in theology. Every class is called theology until it's racial or ethnic. It's black theology or Latino theology. And so what white supremacy does is it puts whiteness in the center of everything so that whiteness is normalized and everything else is otherized. And so that affects everything. Affects our curriculum in schools, right? Who do we read about and who do we learn about? Are we learning from people from the margins in our history books and our theology books and things of that nature? So it's pervasive, and it affects everyone. And yes, it's possible to resist it, but because it is so pervasive, it's very hard to resist it. And so, you know, what I was talking about before, ways of resistance are really deliberately putting yourself in the way of diversity, which is not going to happen in a white supremacist society. The inertia of a racially constructed society is going to pull people apart and isolate them. So it's not just going to happen by you living your life automatically. If you don't do anything about it, you will tend to be racially isolated.
Along those lines, I think earlier you, with some of us, when you were meeting, you used this walkway illustration. I thought that was very helpful.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So there's an analogy in sociological, cultural competency circles of a pedway. And you know a pedway at the airport, it's like a conveyor belt for people, helps you move between the terminals. And so they talk about someone who is actively racist, you know, the KKK, someone who uses racial slurs. They are actually walking along with the conveyor belt. And so they're moving toward their destination faster because they're going with the flow and they're actually giving their own momentum to it. Then it talks about the non-racist. And the non-racist, the person who is standing still on the conveyor belt. But the conveyor belt is still moving. And so the active racist and the non-racist are still going the same direction. It's still going to end up in the same spot. Most people you know are non-racist. That means they're friendly with people across the races. They have friends. They go out to lunch. They have coworkers, all those things. And so they're not foaming at the mouth racists, but that's where it ends. And so this analogy also talks about the anti-racist. So if you imagine that pedway, the racist is walking with it, the non-racist is standing still but still moving in the same direction. The anti-racist is actually turned around and is walking against the grain of the conveyor belt. And what we need in America and in the church is more anti-racists. We need people who are actively working to dismantle the systems. For me personally, two main areas are public education and mass incarceration. Those dramatically affect people of color and the poor. And so adequate funding for public education, properly trained teachers. I personally think principals are really the key to a lot of school turnaround. Most of the focus is on teachers, but I think we need to look very deeply at principal training and preparation as well. And then mass incarceration, the way the criminal injustice system works or doesn't work for certain people. And a lot of times it's based on money, whether they can pay bond or a fee or something like that. And so those are a couple places to start. But learn your own context. I mean, every city has its own issues, and then get involved. You should be showing up at city council meetings, school board meetings, meetings of civic groups, and you should be present, particularly as a person of faith. Are you known as somebody who cares about the city? Are you known as someone who cares about the community? And so as you do that, as you put yourself in the way of people who are different, their concerns are going to start to become your concerns. So I can only speak broadly up here, but as you get involved where you are, you're going to see, oh, immigration is important here, or policing is important here, or the issues of poverty, here's how it plays out where I am, and then you can get involved.
So a pastor friend of mine told me once, you know, Ernie, the homogenous church, and a church that's homogenous in culture and look and feel, it's okay. You don't have to feel guilty about that. And so that as a result, there was resistance for the 20% or so that were of a different culture and feel from the rest of the church. The worship was never, that style of person and their musical taste and whatever was never integrated. There just wasn't an attempt from that church, at least, to integrate that. On the other hand, I've had an African-American friend say, I could see it a mile away when I walk into a church, majority white, and you get the over-exuberant, oh, welcome, you're a black person, you're a nice white church. And so how as a church, how do we move forward in an authentic way? And I think you'd answered some of the question that just a second ago, but how do we move forward authentically, proactively, anti-racist as a church within our own body, but then also in the community?
Yeah, great. I've said this a couple of times today. I really don't think it's a question of practical steps. I think it's a question of courage and will. So oftentimes the resistance to taking the steps that are necessary for diversity aren't for a lack of ideas. It's because people don't want to pay the price of what it will take to have a genuinely diverse congregation or community. And so what I mean is this, in some of the examples I gave, like when MLK went to Southern Seminary, they faced repercussions like a loss of donations, people calling for their jobs, people publicly speaking out against them. So the question is, are your church leaders or your community leaders willing to take on those kinds of consequences for the sake of diversity and racial equality? Because I bet you, if you sat down for 10 minutes and brainstormed a list, you could probably come up with a robust list of practical steps you yourself could take or your community could take to increase racial equality. It's not a poverty of ideas. It's a lack of will to take on the consequences that those ideas entail. And so I often go to the first chapter of Joshua where Moses has died and now it's Joshua who's going to lead the people of Israel into the promised land, cross over the Jordan and take the land. And Joshua is understandably nervous. How do you step in and fill the shoes of Moses? God encourages him by saying 3 times in the first 9 verses, be strong and courageous. And I think we need to hear that today as we think about racial issues, particularly in the church. I think what we need more than ideas is that affirmation of be strong and courageous. And the promise that God gives to Joshua behind the be strong and courageous part is I will be with you. And that's what we have to take as people of faith into this conversation about racial equality, is that we can be strong and courageous because we know we are with God. This is what he wants to see. And no matter what you may endure in this life, loss of job, prestige, status, whatever, relationships, God said, blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And I just don't think we believe that enough when it comes to racial equality. It's not that we don't know what to do, it's that we're not willing to pay the price for doing the right thing. But if we believe that promise, I'm with you, and you're blessed when you're persecuted. And I think we would be bolder like some of these saints and ancestors I mentioned.
Earlier, when you were speaking with some of us, you talked about that the people we look to in the past who have made great gains, paid great prices, and that we don't need to forget that.
Yes. So here's a super practical step.
Oh, yeah.
Don't say Martin Luther King Jr. died, say he was killed.
He's murdered.
He was murdered.
Yeah.
So we're coming up in April on the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And a lot of people say he died as if he, just passed away peacefully in his sleep at an old age. He didn't. He was shot and killed by a racist white supremacist because he had the audacity to preach about the beloved community and to be in Memphis in support of sanitations who were striking for better working conditions. That was his great transgression that got him killed. And so how dare we hold up Martin Luther King and his compatriots in the civil rights struggle as these great examples of Americans and as believers, but we're not willing to endure the same kind of struggle and sacrifice that they had to. So until we're willing to do that, we're not going to see much progress or change.
And this illustration of the pedway is so powerful that to do nothing is to go with this enormous system that was developed very cleverly and over a long period of time. And the only way to actually go against it is to walk against it. So, yes.
Jemar, you've mentioned a ton of resources tonight. What are some books, podcasts, sermons, scriptures that you found personally formative in this arena? And then what would you commend to other people as well?
Good.
Also, before you begin, you're my hero, and I think you're a theological Kobe Bryant.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a compliment. I'm a Bulls fan. Oh, I grew up during the 6-feet era. Thank you. One, go to thewitnessbcc.com. We have wonderful resources, and we actually just put together a resource list of black pastors, writers, and theologians. Because a lot of times people are asking, well, I don't just want to read dead white guys in terms of my theological formation. And so go to thewitnessbcc.com, and we have a whole list of books on theology, history, race, from people of color. So that's helpful. Learn from people from different racial and cultural backgrounds. Some of the things that have been personally formative for me, again, the image of God and the doctrine of the image of God from Genesis 1, Joshua 1, the whole chapter really, but the first 9 verses in particular. But we were talking earlier just about a meta-narrative view, right? So not just sort of proof texting passages, but seeing from Genesis to Revelation, God in Scripture has a plan for diversity. And so it ends up in Revelation 5:9 and 7:9 with people from every tribe and tongue and nation gathering around the throne and worshiping God. But that's not an afterthought. That's not God getting to the 66th book and be like, oh, wait a minute, diversity. Let me write that in there. That was the plan from the very beginning. And so do we know the meta-narrative? And so that book, J. Daniel Hayes, From Every People and Nation, is helpful. But I also, as a student of history, recommend studying history. Now, for folks who are not readers, there's a bunch of documentaries out there right now. So you can watch TV and learn. On Netflix, they still have the documentary 13th. They also have another documentary about O.J. Simpson and his trial that's really enlightening about police brutality and the court system. There's another documentary on PBS called The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross by Henry Louis Gates Jr., professor at Harvard. There was one that just came out 2 days ago, a documentary on HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, called Tell Them We Are Rising. And it's critical that you understand the relationship of African Americans to education, because for so long we were systematically denied an education. And historically black colleges and universities have been a critical part of black education throughout history. So watch those documentaries and then read about the civil rights movement. So historians are constantly frustrated at the fact that many students in the general populace have this idea about civil rights. That one day there was a little old lady named Rosa Parks who refused to get up. Then there was a man named Martin Luther King who led a boycott and gave the I Have a Dream speech. And then they passed the Civil Rights Act and racism was gone.
Sorry.
And that's what, I mean, if you break it down, that's what our popular memory of the civil rights movement amounts to. But there's so much more to it. And so if you study history, I would start with the civil rights movement. Start with folks like Martin Luther King Jr. Many of us, I hadn't even read a full-length biography of King until I got to grad school, because it was never assigned in seminary, that's for sure. So David J. Garrow's Bearing the Cross is really long, but it's really good. A shorter one is Let the Trumpet Sound. Trying to remember the author, it'll come to me, but Let the Trumpet Sound. Those are good places to start, and let those lead you. I also recommend local histories. So histories of Virginia or your local community. Do biographies of other folks are great. There's a couple great biographies. Just Google any name on Amazon, Fannie Lou Hamer, Medgar Evers, Ida B. Wells, all of those things. And there's a bunch of free stuff. I would do Frederick Douglass's autobiography. That's free. I would do W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks. I would do Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. So read black authors and scholars.
Okay, we have two, Corey, I think he was right in front of you. So we have 2 minutes, and this will have to be the last question. But Corey, you can perhaps get him during the refreshment time. Okay, so.
This is just a reflection. I think often the white liberal fantasy of racial equality looks like power sharing. But I feel like it's more like we need to learn from black people and others how not to have power.
Great point, great point. So yes, putting yourself under the authority of persons of color is critical. I realized not that long ago that in most of the audiences I speak to that are predominantly white, they may have only had one or two or maybe no black professors or teachers. They may have never sat under the preaching of a black pastor at a church where they were a member, not just visiting. And so if you think about it, if you've never actually on a consistent basis or a prolonged period had a person of color in a position of authority in your life, it's going to be real hard for you to learn from them. It's going to be real hard for you to consider them on the same intellectual, social level as the people you're used to seeing in authority. And so we have to put ourselves in the position of having to learn from and be subject to in various ways people who are different than we are. And until we gain some more facility and comfort doing that, I think there's going to be a hesitation to look to the margins and to learn from people at the margins. So you're right, a lot of what needs to happen, particularly for folks in the majority, is to experience what it's like not to have power.
Jemar, thanks so much.
Thank you.